into it. Where to begin? I want to just offer a backdrop to why we might be doing this today, because I find that I really think it's important that Dharma practice and Dharma teachings have relevance to the life and the culture that we live in the current present moment. And if you've been paying attention, the culture that we live in the present moment is quite contentious. And I think emotion plays a significant role in why that might be. So I think I just want to offer that as a backdrop of I really hope what we discuss today actually is something that you can bring into your life, into your world immediately that will have beneficial consequences on particularly your emotional life. So cultivating emotional balance is a gigantic universe, and we are going to barely scratch the surface today. And so, with that, what I'm going to kind of say is really what we're going to be doing specifically is looking at integrating mindfulness, whether you want to talk about secular mindfulness or Buddhist mindfulness or insight mindfulness. When I say mindfulness, I mean all of that. And how does mindfulness integrate into the world of emotion? And that is not very clearly out articulated in the culture. And I think it's quite fascinating how little is known about emotions in our emotional lives. Um, so we're gonna spend we'll probably go till about 10:15 and then take a break. So this session will be a little bit heavy on education because there's lots of stuff I want you to know. And then after the break, we'll do a little bit more practice. Um, so let's just look at mindfulness real quickly from the broadest view possible. 10 years ago, the cover of Time magazine had a pretty white lady meditating on it, and it said the mindfulness revolution. And so it's been about 10 years now since mindfulness has really become very widespread to the point where if you're at a health food store, the local co-op or natural grocers or one of these stores, you'll see a magazine called Mindfulness. It's everywhere, and I think this is a good thing. I think it's really important that this is something that has kind of become household names. And there's lots of contention about that. We'll just stay out of that. I think it's really mostly just a good thing. And there's another reason why that this might be the case is a couple of reasons is A, mindfulness just works. Mindfulness has beneficial consequences for our lives on so many different levels. It helps us understand ourselves better, our relationships better. It helps us have more contentment, more meaning. It's really the greatest tool that we can develop. And so that's probably one of the reasons why it's gone very, very popular. There's also some philosophical theories on why mindfulness has become so popular that I want to just point out. And that is many people have articulated, particularly in academia and in current philosophical thought, that we as a species, and particularly in America, are undergoing and have been undergoing for the last several years what's called a crisis of meaning. People are finding that they don't have a lot of meaning in their lives. They're not finding meaning in their jobs. Younger people look at the society and the culture, and of course, the phone has not helped. Because there's so much on offer in the external world, we've become more isolated, we've become more distracted, we've become more polarized, we've become more depressed, we've become more addicted, we've become more unhappy. So clearly, something is not working. And so mindfulness has been pointed out as a response, as a kind of almost an organic response to this situation, where what it's doing is it's allowing people the ability and the skill to stop looking external. This is Buddhism 101, right? Stop looking for external happiness, stop looking for meaning and purpose and happiness in the external world, um, and looking inward. And as we look inward, coming into contact with the stress and the anxiety and doing some good old-fashioned hard work, because mindfulness, Dharma practice, emotional intelligence, everything we're going to talk about today is very counterintuitive and very difficult, which is why people don't want to do it. Also, I want to just name that CEB is a secular training. This is not a Buddhist training, although on some level, I'll be speaking Buddhist language the entire time, but it's not a Buddhist training. It's very secular, and I'll say a little bit of what I mean by that, because secular is a confusing word, and I think it, it, means a little bit everything to everybody. Um, So at this basic level, secular just means this time, this era, this world that we live in. But basically, kind of secular could basically just mean the present moment. And so, how can practices, ancient wisdom practices, have relevance for the life that we live now? Now, whether you consider yourself a religious Buddhist or a Buddhist or not a Buddhist or whatever you think you are, whatever you term you want to use is all fine and good. It all fits happily under the title of secular. But unless you're a monastic, you're a secular Dharma practitioner. If you pay taxes and you deal with money and deal with sexuality and you eat food past noon and all of these things, you are a secular person. That's just the way it is. And so that doesn't mean that secularity is not in opposition to religion. People who have deep religious faith are also considered secular people. So it's kind of a broad lens. If you want to read more about this, I highly recommend a book that was written many years ago that's actually more relevant now, today, than it was when it was written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, called Beyond Religion, which is a book on secular ethics, which is a really great book. Um, and so for me, I teach and practice and consider myself what I teach is called secular Dharma. Some of that for the reasons that I've pointed out, and many of them, and I'll talk about them now, for very personal reasons, because many years ago, I was involved with a big Buddhist organization called Against the Stream. Some of you might be familiar with that, in which I exited that community about 2 years before it actually collapsed. And during that journey out of Against the Stream, kind of moving to Colorado 8 years ago, going through a motorcycle accident where I almost died, going through actually a radical turning point, a huge transition in my life. I also, luckily enough, found a dear friend of mine, Eve Ekman, whose father's Paul Ekman, who's the famous emotion researcher, who really developed this training with Alan Wallace. And this training was actually paid for, the development of this training was paid for by the Dalai Lama and his organization because he felt it was so important to get this work out there. And I personally realized that I always felt, and you might relate to this, I always felt, really generally speaking, that there was something kind of wrong with me. I always felt like I lived in the world in a way that I always felt a bit uncomfortable no matter where I went. And I always felt like things were a little bit harder for me than they were for everybody else. At least that's the way I observed things. I felt like I was having an internal conflict that I was the only one who was having it, and I was having it at such a high level that it haunted me for most of my life. And for me, this was rooted in trauma, and it manifested as addiction. And I've been in substance abuse recovery for over 20 years now. Um, so I always felt that that was the case, even through my sobriety, even up until Dharma practicing and sitting all these retreats. I always felt there was something going on inside of me that wasn't quite right. And then when I entered the world of cultivating emotional balance, it all became very clear to me. And it was very relieving to realize that actually I was correct. There was something going on inside of me, but it wasn't only happening to me. And it was called emotions. I was having these things called emotions, and I don't know if you noticed this, but when we just a couple things about emotion is you're not always emotional. Okay. And this is where mindfulness and emotion becomes tricky because mindfulness is we're always talking about mindfulness. We want to be present in every moment, right? Like that's kind of the training. But we're not always emotional. And mostly you're not emotional. We become emotional. And we usually don't, when we become emotional, when we experience the physiological onset of an emotion, we generally don't know that that's what's happening. But you'll notice when you have an emotional episode, and this is the way that I tracked it, all of a sudden things feel like they're harder. I was fine 5 minutes ago. Now I don't know, something's off. I don't know what's going on with me. And that's called emotion. And that is a universal experience that we all share as human beings. It's hardwired into the biological structure. We'll talk about this a bit later. And we all share in them. And we all have a different emotional profile. And we all have different strategies and tools that we use to deal with emotion. And most of us have no idea at all about any of this, even though it's happening all the time. And it's mostly because we don't have proper education on it. And so just one more thing about secular Dharma that I just want to name that might be a little bit contentious, but I think it's important. And it's very relevant to the society that we are living in right now. And that is what is identified as a universal emotion, which in Paul Ekman's assessment is the most destructive emotion that we have. And if the human race doesn't make it, it will largely because of this emotion, and it's called contempt. And contempt is a very challenging emotion, A, because it doesn't have a lot of physiology to it. Like when you become angry or you become scared, you really feel it in your body. When contempt arises, you don't really have a lot of feeling viscerally. And what contempt is, it's asserting moral superiority and it's devaluing the other person. And this work has been really, really articulated well by the Gottman Institute, John and Julie Gottman, who have done all this work and research on divorce. They've been studying divorce and marriages for years, and they say once contempt enters into the relationship in the marriage, once one person has contempt for the other person in the marriage is basically over. And so it's really important to name this. Now, I don't have to, I'll just say this because it's true. If you look at the election that we just had and you looked at both sides, I don't care what side of the fence you're on, you probably have contempt for the other side of the fence. And let me tell you, that is going to help nobody. Nobody's going to benefit from that. And we really, as a society, we need to get lectured in contempt. Okay. And both sides think that they have the moral superior high ground and the other person gets devalued, right? To the point, even when I live in rural Colorado, people get signs yanked out of their yard. It's there. I don't want to be, I'll try to keep my language clean, but it's fucking bananas and it's really a big problem. Now, Buddhists are really guilty of this because there's a guy named Evan Thompson who I highly recommend you check out his work. He has a book called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. I actually interviewed him for my Secular Dharma podcast. And he talks about what's called Buddhist exceptionalism. And Buddhist exceptionalism is a lot of, no offense, and I include myself in this, so I'm not lecturing you, I'm not scolding you, is that we can oftentimes think that Buddhism is the superior religion because it's more sophisticated psychologically. It doesn't really have necessarily a God structure, these kinds of things. We can assume that we have the superior understanding about reality and the universe and how one should behave, which is very much rooted in contempt. Now, I have a little bit of this. I suspect all of you have a little bit of this. Don't beat yourself up for it. It's not a problem, really. It's called contempt. It's a universal emotion. Everybody has it. And the reason I bring this up is because I occupy lots of different roles in various Buddhist communities, but people, because they know I'm a very secular kind of middle person, I have students that I work with very intimately one-on-one who have deep Christian values. I have people that I work with one on one who voted in the red paradigm and have very conservative political views, who don't feel welcome in these spaces, and that's a problem. And so people a lot of times will confide in me because I'm so interested in all of this. I don't really have much of opinion. I mean, I have plenty of opinions, but I don't hold very tightly to them. But I think that if we are going to, you know, if somebody comes into your Dharma center wearing the red hat, like you should be kind and friendly and welcoming. And if you're not, what the hell are we doing? Like to be kind and friendly to people who agree with you, like you shouldn't get a trophy for that. Like if you find it easy to be kind and generous and benevolent with people who share your political and social values, like really, I'm not very impressed. Now, I live in this little small town in Colorado, which is actually on NPR recently because our town is so politically polarized. And but we all get along here, because you know what? I go to my kid's basketball game and my kid's playing basketball with he's on the same team with his other kid. In the left red paradigm where I live is super intense. And so people are mostly like, because of that, they mostly politely put it aside, and we do really, really well here. But I have friends, really, really good friends, who sit on both sides of these things. And if you can't have friends who sit on both sides of these things, then I would say that you have work to do. And if you really take this practice seriously and you take something like metta, kindness, if that's a value that you hope to dwell in and to articulate and to bring to the world, you're going to probably have to look at some aspects of your psychological, emotional experience that maybe aren't that pretty to look at. And the reason I say all of this is when I was in my cultivating emotional balance training and I learned about contempt, I learned about everything I just talked about. I was like, oh shit. I was like, I just feel like I got a Buddhist downgrade because I started to pay attention to it. And it's like I noticed it when I came back at the airport. I was sitting in the airport, and I don't know what it is about the airport, but I get really judgmental in the airport. Like if I'm sitting for my flight, everybody who walks by me, I just character assess. I just make a character assessment of every person. Every once in a while, someone will sneak by and I won't have anything. We're like, oh my God, look at this guy. Fucking Jesus, this guy. I'm just like, I'm not even like doing it. It's just happening. And a lot of it is contempt. And so I just want to kind of put this in the backdrop because I think this is very relevant to all of our lives right now. We all have to be careful and we all have to take responsibility for how we navigate these tricky experiences. So that's maybe longer than I wanted to talk about. I really wanted to kind of give this as a kind of frame for thinking about this stuff because I'm sure you all know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You're familiar with this. And I think this is public enemy number one. This is how we've gotten ourselves into the situation that we're in. It's contempt. People think it's anger and fear. It's not. It's those also, but what sits at the bottom of this is feeling morally superior to another person or having an intellectual superiority, which is more likely the case, right? Which is Buddhist exceptionalism. Watch out for your intellectual superiority. I don't get caught up in that so bad because I'm a high school dropout and I have no education, so it's easy for me to just remind myself that I genuinely don't know what the hell I'm talking about, especially when it comes to social and political. I don't know anything about politics. Why I would even have a political opinion is crazy, right? So let's talk a little bit about. I talked a little bit about the backdrop, but I do want to talk about a bit about the backstory because in 1995, Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. Some of you are familiar with this book. It was on the New York Times bestsellers list. I think it still is in the top 10. Um, and nobody picked up the ball and ran with it. This is 1995. This is what, 30 years ago? And it never really, we have things like social emotional learning, which actually is a really watered down system. They don't talk about emotions. A lot of the MBSR, a lot of the secular stuff that I actually like and appreciate has generally kind of opted to not really deal with the emotional content so much, which I think has been a very foolish move. Nobody wants to deal with the emotional content because it's charged you know? And so the Dalai Lama in the year 2000 held a huge international conference in Dharamsala, India, because he recognized in 2000 that this was a problem for the human race. And he was like, we need to figure this out. So he invited psychologists, therapists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, social scientists, Buddhist monks. He invited people from all these different backgrounds to India and said, we need to figure this out. And so this entire conference, if you want to read about it, was captured in a book written by Daniel Goleman called Destructive Emotions. And the whole book is a kind of recapitulation of this conference. It's a really fabulous, very interesting book. That's, 20 years old now. Um, and so the assessment is the backdrop, what they came up with is the East versus West paradigm is very, very interesting. So let's start with the West. Start with the East. Let's start with Buddhism. Buddhism has a tremendously deep, rich, precise understanding of what the mind is and what mind functions are. Like they kind of have it all sorted out. Psychological, mind experience, Abhidharmic thought, Buddhist psychology is very, very precise, very, very sophisticated, and it has been studied and researched through first person experience for 2,500 years. If you want to understand the mind, its function, and its processing, the Buddhists have that. You don't even want to go anywhere else. That's what they've decided to focus on. However, they don't have any understanding of emotion as we know it in the West. There's not one word in Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, all the traditional Buddhist languages. They don't have a word that would be an equivalent to what we call emotion in the West. So even though the East has the mind very, very sorted out, here in the West, we actually have the emotions really, really well sorted out. We understand them from their evolutionary biological role, why we got them, when we got them, what their function is, what their purpose is. Very, very well laid out in great scientific discourse. Now, I will add this. Um, one thing about emotion researchers is, and this is kind of funny, is they don't agree on everything and they fight intensely. So there's lots of debate in this world of emotions and science of emotions. But I would just say, and this is just my opinion and in my experience, I think when it comes to understanding emotions in a way that can be constructive and useful, there's really nobody Paul Ekman is sort of the top of the food chain. Paul Ekman, who was invited by the Dalai Lama. You could actually watch, you can go to Mind Life Institute and you can watch the conversations between Paul Ekman and the Dalai Lama, and they are unbelievably fascinating. Um, and so Paul Ekman was the emotion researcher who that we kind of we mostly use his model. People have pushed back against it, but generally about 70% of emotion researchers across the globe agree with Ekman's assessment of emotions and how they work. And so turns out the only vehicle really to deal with emotions, the only way you can change your emotional landscape and use your emotions in a way that are less reactive, more beneficial, is through a practice called mindfulness. In fact, and this is interesting, if you look at the research on mindfulness, which there has been over 2,500 peer-reviewed articles, and all of this has been captured in the book by Dan Goleman and Richard Davidson called Altered Traits. Great book, came out a couple years ago. Um, and every study that they've done on mindfulness, they always list the benefits. And there's one benefit that shows up in every single study, and that is increased emotion regulation. So even if you don't know anything about emotions and you don't have any emotional intelligence and you don't know shit, just by virtue of having a mindfulness practice, you're going to that one of the byproducts of that is you will be better emotionally regulated. That just sort of happens. That's one of the kind of side effects of mindfulness. Now, usually you'll see this translated in generally secular mindfulness research. They use the word self-regulation, which I think is a kind of a foolish move because the word self is complicated. When you see self-regulation, you can just decode that. What they're saying is actually emotion regulation. Because when you are self-regulating, what are you regulating? You're regulating emotion. So mindfulness and emotion regulation is the game that you want to be in. Okay, and this is a secular perspective. This is really um, what we are wanting to do. And I can tell you from the last 10 years of having done it, I feel like I got a massive upgrade in my Dharma practice because now I know exactly what we're dealing with, right? So, what is emotion? Well, let's go with a basic model of emotion. And this will also be very controversial, but it just happens to be true. So, emotions happen in episodes. And the basic model of emotion is it's a three-phase model. And that means there's a trigger, there's an experience, and there's a response. Something triggers my emotional experience. Um, I have the experience of that, and then I respond. And the goal in cultivating emotional balance and emotional intelligence is very, very clear. The goal is not to stop getting triggered. And I'll say this because I work in substance abuse a lot, and this is happening a lot. A lot of times, if you listen to a podcast, people do trigger, this whole trigger warning thing. Like, we got to cut that shit out. That's ridiculous. Because um, once the trigger of emotion is installed in your system, Ekman says it's actually impossible to remove it. And I'll give you a very personal example. I was sexually molested by the paper boy when I was a small boy. Who, when I would go visit my grandparents in Massachusetts, there was this kid who lived down the street who was the paper boy, and he would like, it wasn't, it wasn't really aggressive. It was just kind of weird. He kind of would beat me up and bully me and make me take my pants down. It wasn't like really aggressive, but it was like really fucking traumatizing, and I did not like it. And he was big enough that he could kind of bully me. And every day he would come, not every day, but when he would come over to ask me to play, of course, my grandparents would make me go with him. And I'd be like, don't make me go with this guy. And of course, I didn't say anything because you never do. But when he would come over, he always had his papers with him. And newspapers have a very strong smell. And every time, if I'm on an airplane and somebody sits down next to me with a newspaper, like we don't even keep newspaper. If I smell a newspaper, I literally get filled with a murderous rage, right? And most of my life, I didn't know that. My parents would read the newspaper, and if I came in the kitchen and they were on the kitchen table and I could smell the newspaper, I would just get like so mad. And it wasn't until I did trauma therapy years later that I made the connection. And now I know it and I get it. But if I still smell the newspaper, I still get the murderous rage. I can't make it not happen. So we really have to be careful that we need to make sure that we are not trying to get in the business of trigger management. That's not your strategy. And then we get into trigger blaming. We blame all the people and we blame society and we blame culture for triggering us. It's like, you know what? That is so unhelpful. You couldn't do it anyway, right? And so we have to realize, so let's just see like the way this is defined. Um, so given that we are not always experiencing emotions, it is important for us to learn how emotions are triggered. A trigger of emotion occurs when some type of event happens in the present moment. An event could be an interaction with a person, a place, a situation, an image, a thought, a memory, a smell, a sound, a taste, a tactile sensation, a visual experience, an idea that we encounter externally or from within our own mind. And this is to say that literally anything can trigger emotion. Any bit of phenomenological experience can trigger emotion. The world is saturated with emotional triggers. So if you want to get in the business of trying to manage that, you're going to go bananas. You simply can't do it. So that's how that works. And when the onset of emotion, our experience is colored and influenced by emotion, which is, creates a mental state. This is where mindfulness is very, very helpful. Emotion contributes to physiological changes such as increase in heart rate, sweating, skin temperature. In anger and fear, the heart rate increases. In anger, the blood flows to our hands to fight. In fear, runs to our feet. The blood runs to our feet to run. Um, and so these are kind of what we're dealing with here. A simple definition of emotion would be an emotion is a process that happens when we sense something important to our welfare is occurring. This is very important because it happens all the time. And this also deals with something like if you have trauma, if you have PTSD, which I've had most of my adult life, your emotional trigger system is going to be a lot worse than everybody else's. In fact, I jokingly say when people talk about privilege, I always talk about the privilege of being untraumatized. Like just being able to walk through the world without being traumatized, man, that must be like really nice, you know? And so when I sense, now it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm correct. Somebody sits down next to me on an airplane with a newspaper. Am I in danger? No. Do I think I'm about to get sexually molested? On some level, yes. So in that moment, so emotions don't have time, they don't have sequence, they don't have language. They don't know that I'm, 50 years old. They don't have that kind of information. So they're operating on a very, very old paradigm. And I'm sensing something to my welfare is occurring. And anytime that happens, it's going to trigger the emotion. And this process is influenced by our appraisal of the situation, how we perceive what is happening, how I think or how I make sense of what is happening. And by and large, we no fault of our own, the way perception works as an aggregate of psychology is uh, your mind's always telling you what's happening, right? It's kind of like a play-by-play narrator, but it's wrong a lot. And so a lot of times, and so when emotion gets when we get triggered into emotion, the story we're telling ourselves is going to be a lot more exaggerated than if we aren't emotional. This is why emotions are so difficult because when you become emotional, you kind of become a different person. You're operating on the amygdala's turning on, you're operating on old memories, you're kind of time traveling. You become a bit of a different person. The current version of yourself is now being influenced by past emotional events. And you might notice this when you're emotional. You kind of can't, you can't think straight. You can't think clearly. And you actually can't, right? So we really have to understand that what we're up against, this can be done, but I think we need to respect, at least I need to respect uh, the systems that we're going up against when we become emotional. This is not easy work. It's not easy work at all. And it's really easy, as I'm sure you've noticed, when you become emotional, to blame the trigger for your emotion, which can oftentimes be somebody else. Blaming your emotional reactivity or your emotional experience on an external trigger, it's just not helpful. It's unskillful. It doesn't help, right? And it's very disempowering because what it does is it's putting us in a position where we're not interested or willing to take responsibility for what is happening inside of us. And we know by and large that Buddhist meditation is about, coming into your direct experience and trying to take responsibility for what's happening in the internal landscape. Now, when you become emotional, that game, it becomes a lot more difficult. Does that make sense? So I do want to, before I get into the universals, I do want to pause because I realize you guys are probably trying to drink out of a fire hose right now, which is why I'm glad this is being recorded. And also you have the handout, so don't worry. But is there any questions anybody has? Or is there anything that is anybody feeling like they're kind of off? Is there anything you want me to kind of articulate a little bit more before we move on? Yeah, Samuel.
Yeah, I have one question about the term emotional. And so far, it seems like when you're using the term emotional, when you become emotional, it's associated with negative emotions. And I'm just a little curious about how the flip side of that, of a positive emotion, and is that, how does that work?
Well, first of all, you're jumping the gun, and that's okay because you're actually speaking to the one. If there's one thing I want you to take from this training today, it's what I'm about to say. We have got to get out of the language of negative and positive. Emotions aren't negative or positive. Most people use that language, and most of them are negative. You're like anger, sadness, shame, they're all shit. And so when you look at the trigger of emotions, and this is what came out of the conference, is that emotions are universal. We all have them. We have a trigger of an emotion, and then we have the experience of the emotion, and then there's how we respond. And everything comes down to how we respond. And I talked about the Brahma Viharas the other night. I'll talk about those later on after our break and articulate that. Anger, any emotion can be enacted in constructive and destructive. So we don't want to use the language of, we want to just completely dump the language of negative and positive. Please dump that language. Emotions can be enacted in ways that are constructive or destructive. A destructive emotion, by definition, is any response that is no longer willing to further collaborate with the other person, which is our political system right now. It's a shut off. It's destructive because we're no longer willing to further collaborate. A constructive emotion is the opposite. Isn't it acted in ways where there's further collaboration? Like it's like, hey Samuel, like I don't agree with you on that. Like I actually have very strong opinions, and it's like, okay, cool. Like we can't be friends anymore, like because you don't like blue and I don't like red. It's just like so we what makes something constructive is there's a willingness to because I value the relation. I'm just using you for an example here, but like because you're my friend and I value our relationship, The fact that I value our relationship is so important to me that I'm willing to be in conflict with you about this one thing. And this is the advanced skill that nobody seems to have or be interested in having. It's like, so it's like, how much do we value the relationship? It's like, and so that makes it constructive. Now, you can have anger, they call it hyper or hypo. So you can have emotion. So let's use anger because anger is an easy one. You can have an anger hypo, which is excessive. Too much anger, of course, can be destructive. You can also have anger deficit, which is also destructive. It's actually possible that your problem is you're not angry enough. This is people who get taken advantage of, people who have poor boundaries, people who don't advocate for themselves, they don't stick up for themselves. You know what I mean? They let people walk all over them. This happens a lot in in the workplace. This is very common in the workplace because there's an anger deficit. So, so emotions can be constructive and destructive. All of them can be. So that's the metric that we want to use. So anger is not the problem. My relationship and my responses to anger is what matters. So again, like trying to be like, oh, I need to be less angry. Like that's not really an option. So what happens is our general way of navigating emotions is it's just not going to work. And so what do? We drink, we take drugs, like I mean, all addiction really is an emotion regulation strategy. That's what it is at its core. If you don't like how you feel and you drink 6 beers, you're gonna feel better. And that's the problem with addiction is it fucking works. If people aren't stupid, people, it's not a moral judgment. As a human being, you have to regulate emotion. So you do whatever you have to do to do it. And a lot of us have very destructive behaviors that we engage in to regulate that emotion. It could be shopping, it could be scrolling, it could be eating, you know. And so, yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that question, Samuel, because that is really the big takeaway. Is like, okay, like, and then we can do these emotional profiles, like, okay, like, what emotions do I feel like I'm doing well with? Some people are like, well, fear, not such a problem. Anger, gee, that's a big problem for me, or is it shame? So that's a really, I almost feel like I told you in advance to ask that question when you did. So thank you. Good
Thank,
catch on your
thank
part.
you. Thank you.
Yes, please, Mariana.
Hey, just a simple question. When you said the definition of contempt, it was asserting moral superiority and what?
Devaluing the other person.
Okay, thank you.
And if I'm going to assert moral superiority, or probably nowadays, probably more like intellectual superiority, I have to devalue. I have to make that move. I have to devalue you. Self-righteous indignation. You know, it's no good. There's no teaching on right contempt. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah. So yeah, so that's how that works. Anything else before we get into the universals and how they operate? All right. Very cool. Let's do it then. And they're also in all this stuff I'm saying is in the handout, so that's actually helpful for you, I think. So let's just go through. So this is something that I've done that's actually not part of CEB or part of emotional science, but I find it to be a helpful teaching module. So I'll do it to you right now. There's 8 universal emotions. Not everybody agrees on that, but there's 8. We're going to talk about the 8 universals. And I break them down into sort of basic ones, which is the ones kind of everybody knows: anger, fear, sadness, and joy. And then I call these other ones called complex emotions, which are not as obvious: surprise, disgust, contempt, and shame. So in Ekman's work, um, what makes the criteria of a universal emotion is a couple of things. Um, is the way that it arises physiologically. So when you become anger, if you're a human being living on the planet and you get angry, blood is going to rush to your hands. I don't care where you're from. That's going to happen. The other thing that's really going to happen that I'm trained in, a lot of times I don't like to tell my mentees this because it makes them nervous. I can read faces. I'm trained in Paul Ekman's facial action cues. Um, Actually, just a little cultural side note. If you've ever seen the TV show that came out many years ago called Lie to Me, it's a great show, Lie to Me with Tim Roth. The character Tim Roth plays is based on Paul Ekman. And so Paul Ekman actually worked for the CIA and the FBI because he developed the system where you can tell if somebody's lying by their facial expressions and you can tell what emotion they're experiencing. So the other criteria for universal emotion is facial expressions. When people now, whether you're from Finland, Bozeman, or Spain, or Baltimore, when you get angry, you go like this. And so they also use this word microaggression. So like, so you know you can tell by someone's face they're feeling. Now they might not know they're feeling it. They might not know why they're feeling it. But when you make that face, that's anger, and that makes it universal. And so we have these universal emotions, and the reason so that why do we have them? The way if you study emotions, you should be studying emotions in biology class, not in psychology class. Okay, they are a feature. They're a legacy of our uh, neurodevelopment. And so they came online. We didn't get them all at once. It's understood that they kind of came online as needed to help us survive. So emotions are about survival. Now, they probably imagined that fear and anger were probably the first ones we got. So let's just talk about we'll go through them and talk about their roles. So every universal emotion has a physiological, blood rushes to the hands, facial expression. They also have a function. They are designed to do something. And so is what anger is trying to do is it's trying to fight, to remove, or overcome an obstacle. Do you have any obstacles in your life that you would like to overcome? Any obstacles in your life that you would like to remove? If you're going to do that, it is going to require you to use anger in a constructive way to accomplish that task. That's what it's for. Now, it goes sideways, clearly, but so so if I become angry, which I do a couple times a day, something triggers that anger, something to my welfare is occurring, and that anger arises and says, you need to overcome this, you need to remove this, you need something needs to happen. Somebody makes a rude comment to my kid on the playground, right? Like nothing will trigger anger in me like somebody messing with my family, which is weird too, because I actually, since I've had kids, I've become more angry. You know, like it's almost like a Papa Bear thing. It's like I think there's like a chemical that gets released in your brain when you have kids. Or it's just like if you mess with man, you mess with my kids, we're gonna have a problem. And that happens real fast. And so then the question becomes, well, how do I deal with this situation in a constructive way rather than a destructive way? Man, that is hard. That is very, very hard, but you can do it. And of course, the interesting thing is to do that, what you need most is mindfulness. And that is you've been triggered, you're angry, and you say to yourself, oh man, I am so angry right now. I better be careful about what I do or what I say, because when I'm angry, I say and do things that I regret later. Are you familiar with this? Right. So that's what anger is for. So if you have an obstacle or some challenge in your life you want to overcome, you're going to need to use some anger to pull that off. And that's a very slippery slope. So anger is not negative. Anger is really useful. In fact, not having enough of it, your obstacles and problems and challenges in life are going to pile up all over you if you have an anger deficit. So that's anger. Fear. is a little different. Fear and anger kind of they think came on first. Um, Pretty obvious. Anger is fights or flees from danger. It's trying to escape a threat. It's about escaping a threat. I should be more accurate, trying to escape a perceived threat. Okay. That means I'm feeling that something to my welfare is occurring. In the modern age, fear is mostly tied to what we call anxiety. And anxiety is considered a diagnostic, disorder and generalized. People say generalized. I remember hearing generalized anxiety disorder. If you don't have generalized anxiety disorder, you don't have a pulse. You know what I mean? I think that shit's funny, right? So this is also, I'll get on my high horse for a little bit. This really bothers me about our society. We talk about mental health crisis. We really don't have a mental health crisis. We have an emotional health crisis because anxiety is all anxiety is a destructive response to fear. Have you ever benefited from your anxiety? Like when I'm worried about money, like sitting in my office worrying about money, it's not like a bag of cash appears out of nowhere, but I do it. And so what it is, so I always when I start to get when I'm starting to get anxious, I ask myself, what's the fear? Or specifically, what is the perceived threat? Now, it's so hard in the modern world. There's been much written on this. Perceived threat is very, very tricky because a perceived threat is, there's not a tiger on the other side of my door, but it might feel like there is. So the viscerality, the physiology of emotions can be very, very high and intense, which is telling your system, this is really, really important, and we need to figure this out right now. But what's the perceived threat? I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage in February. It's like, well, dude, that's kind of far away. And like, I have a lot of work between now and February. Like, that's actually very unlikely. I've never actually, since I've lived in this house, never missed a mortgage payment. Why I think I'm going to miss February's is delusional, you know? And so this perceived threat, I mean, this is the news cycle. What is the news cycle? The news cycle is one perceived threat. Well, you better wear this. Oh my God, who do you like? Oh my God, who's Homeland Security Director? Oh my God, it's just like every piece of information that comes out of the news person's mouth is a perceived threat that you need to worry about. Have you noticed? You know? Oh my God, who did he appoint to this cabinet? It's like, I'm not saying it's not real. I'm not saying to just stick your head in the sand, but man, I can get really fucking crazy in my head. I can ruin my whole day, and I do sometimes, over stuff that is perceived. And it's kind of jammed down my throat on my little screen. But who's the idiot who picked it up and started watching it at 6 o'clock in the morning instead of doing my daily meditation? You ever do that? Let's go see what and so that in of itself is an addiction. Anxiety is an addiction that you get nothing out. At least the alcoholic gets drunk. The anxiety junkie gets nothing. It's like so bad. Who is it? Rumi who says it? Fear is the cheapest room in the house. I hate to see you sitting there. Right. So we could talk about fear all day, but this is just so like just the connection is to make is that like anxiety, when you feel anxious, just ask yourself the question, what's the perceived threat? That's what it's about. Anxiety dependently originates on a fear perceived threat. We want to use Buddhist language on this one. So what is the fear that the anxiety is rising out of? And let's cut it off at the lowest common denominator. Because if you work with the fear, if you regulate fear from a mindfulness point of view, and dare I say, bring in some metta, anxiety cannot arise from a place of kind awareness. It's got nothing to grab on. This is why people like metta. They're like, oh man, metta feels good. Yeah, because there's no anxiety. Um, my favorite one, which I think is the most beautiful emotion in the human system, is sadness. Mostly because I have lived a large part of my life with a very destructive relationship to sadness. And unfortunately, when you have a destructive relationship to sadness, one of the side effects is you end up having a destructive relationship to joy. No sadness, no joy. And to be honest with you, I was like, well, I was happy with that. I was like, that's a fair trade. If I don't have to be sad again, you can keep the joy. I don't even want it. Which I really actually say I can tell you with all honesty, I felt that way for a long time. Right. And so sadness so now we're getting into emotions that are more relational. Anger and fear, anger and fear are really kind of tiger, eating me in the other room stuff. Very survivalistic. Sadness is about the trigger of sadness. Sadness is all about loss, right? The biggest so when we experience loss, whether you lost your car keys or your iPhone or your mom or your dog or we all one of the way that I experienced the trauma that I went through mostly in my life was catastrophic loss. My sister's she's 15 years old, she's driving to school in the school bus. She's supposed to be in the school bus, she's in a car, she gets in a car accident, she's dead. I've had about five of those with various family members or people that I was close to. And so that's very destabilizing because you also have this feeling of like, holy shit, this can happen at any time. And my mind will go there quick. I mean, it happened to me the other day. I was at my son's basketball game and Coyote was out on the playground playing and I wasn't watching him. I was like, I better get out there. What if he falls off the jungle gym? Oh my God, he could be on the dead on the ground right now. And I'm like, whoa, dude, easy, bro. But my mind does this. I go fast and I go hard, to this kind of catastrophic thinking, right? And it's really hard to turn around. And it's like, so loss, is a big part of life. And so this is very interesting. What is the role of loss or what is the role of sadness? What sadness is trying to do is it's trying to get you to elicit connection from another person in the face of loss. Well, what if you don't have somebody? What if that is too scary of a proposition? So what do people generally do when they're sad? They don't elicit connection. They do the opposite. They isolate, which is the last thing you want to do. And also, too, let's be honest, I always notice this like sadness, tears of sadness, kind of socially unacceptable. I noticed this when I was working in treatment, I was doing family work where people were like in drug treatment, and then their family would come in and they would hash out all the stuff. It was like super intense. One of the really most interesting things I've ever done. And as soon as one drop falls out of somebody's eyes, what happens? Somebody hands them a box of tissues, which is very well intentioned, but actually kind of destructive. Because what you're saying is get your shit together. That's the implied underlining mechanism. Now, the intention is not, the intention and the impact are always quite different. So I actually, even when I teach retreat and we meet for groups, if there's a box of tissues, which the retreat manager always puts one there, which is fine, and I understand, I kind of put it off to the side, you know. And I dare you to do that. Next time you cry, see if you can cry for a minute or two without, let the water run down your face. I dare you. So good for you. But how quick do you run for the tissue as soon as one drop comes out of the eye? Immediately, right? And so the other thing about that can happen if you have traumatic sadness, catastrophic loss, is we can start to feel shame about our sadness. And that is, let me tell you from direct experience, that sucks. That's the worst, you know? That's brutal. And so the way out of it is to actually feel the sadness and then to try to connect with somebody who's going to be able to sit with you in that. And that's a risky proposition. And by and large, what we do now is we have to go pay somebody $250 an hour to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I do that, but I think that's a little bit sad that we don't, so one of the things we can do as practitioners is we can become the person that other people go to. That's like the most generous, beautiful thing you can do as a practitioner is becoming a trustworthy person to say, oh, you know what? I really feel sad. I'm going to go talk to so and so because they'll be with this with me, right? And so if we look at the other side of sadness, so let's talk about joy or enjoyment. Um, the role of that is to deepen connection with others. So sadness elicits the connection, joy deepens the connection. So joy and sadness are emotions that start to bring us into the social dimension. They're generally now we can go for a walk, we can go for a hike, we can go out in nature and feel joy. We can feel joy. It doesn't have to be about other people, but oftentimes it is, and it's about cooperation with self and others. So we want to be able to have a joyous experience with ourselves. Now I'll talk about this more this afternoon, but they're just kind of not this afternoon after the break. Um, there are two sets in Buddhist thought that sit with these, and that would be compassion and gratitude. These Brahma Viharas. So so we talk about the joy and sorrow, 10,000 joys, 10,000 sorrows, as they talk about in Chan Buddhism. This is exactly what we're talking about. And so compassion is the appropriate response that we have to the sorrows of our life. And joy and appreciation and gratitude are our responses to um, the pleasant, beautiful aspects of our life. But if you can't actually allow yourself to experience sadness, compassion's more or less going to be off the table, which means that gratitude and appreciation are more or less going to be off the table. So the price that you pay to not be sad is not worth it. The user's fee for sadness repression is terrible. All right. So I really want to nail this home because I went through this personally, and let me tell you, it was brutal. So those are the four basics, I call them. Any questions or anything you want me to say more about those? I feel like I kind of unpacked those pretty good. But this shit's happening every day. These are very, very common experiences. Any questions or thoughts you want me to, if you want to hear more about those? You guys feel pretty good there. All right. So now we're talking about surprise, disgust, contempt, and shame. I'm not going to say a lot about surprise because it's kind of not that interesting. Most people don't know that surprise is an emotion, first of all. But surprise is highly correlated to the startle response. So a lot of times the first trigger, emotional trigger, is surprise. And then it might be surprise and then fear or surprise and anger. So surprise is kind of the emotion that kicks the door open. We get startled, right? So a lot of times surprise is considered the startle response. And basically what surprise does is it focuses attention to identify something, you know? So that's what happens at startle. We look at it. What's going on there? Is that a tiger? Is it a snake or is it a rope? Right. That's what that does. So it's interesting. So psychologically, surprise is highly tied to the attention, which is a huge topic in Buddhist meditation, also in emotion regulation, but also startle. So almost surprise kicks on that whole second noble truth territory. Surprise kind of triggers a reaction, doesn't it? So once that happens, we really need to be mindful because that if we are non-participators in this, then things can go sideways. So these other ones like surprise, most people probably didn't know that surprise was an emotion. Disgust, a lot of people don't know that disgust is emotion. Disgust is highly correlated to what we would call the hindrance of aversion. The signal of disgust is get this away from me. It's trying to remove something harmful or poisonous. Now, maybe you can guess this. Do you know what the universal facial expression of disgust is? Michelle just did it. Which is interesting, right? If you go on vacation and you come home and you make some coffee and you want to check the half and half to make sure it's still good, what do? You go, reason we do that. That's and so like you'll notice it. In fact, when I hang out with my friend Eve Ekman, which I don't get to do very much anymore, she's really, really trained in her dad's system. So I always tell her when we meet, I say, listen, if you pick up any emotional cues from me, I go, please tell me. So we'll be talking about something, and she'll go, She'll go, what was that? I'll go, what do you mean? She goes, you just flashed disgust. And I'll go, oh, actually, you know what? I really can't stand that person. Like, and so like I always ask her because it's so interesting to have somebody be like, hey, you just did, because I didn't know I did it, but we're doing this all the time. And so disgust is about getting rid of something poisonous and harmful. And so now let's talk about the relationship between disgust and contempt, because I think this is very, very relevant. Contempt and disgust are highly related to each other, but you can be disgusted by anything phenomenologically. I can be disgusted by a person's behavior. I can be disgusted by a smell. I can be disgusted by something that I see. Any of my sense experiences can trigger disgust. Contempt, on the other hand, is only triggered by a human being. You can't have contempt for, you know, rotten garbage. You can be disgusted by it. So, like, to give you just an example of that, if I can be driving down my car and watching somebody walking their dog and the dog is pooping on the sidewalk, and I can be disgusted by that, but I can also have contempt for the person for not picking it up. Does that make sense? Because what I'm doing is I'm I'm devaluing the person. So this is the massive hack. If there's another thing you take home from this, do this. I can be disgusted by something that you do. I can be disgusted by a view that you hold. I can be disgusted by a political view that you hold without having contempt for you as a human being. That's what we need to be able to do. Right? Now, let me tell you, it's very easy for me to sit here and say that. To actually perform that task in real time, that is like advanced emotional intelligence. Like if you even pull that off once in a while, I'll send you a trophy. That is really what we want to be able to do. Because what I'm doing is now we can have a conversation about like the view. Like let's talk about that. So it's trying to have the disgust without the contempt for the person. Now, Paul Ekman will go so far as to say this. I actually got to meet with him a couple times, and I love the guy. Um, He actually believes that contempt is the only emotion that cannot be engaged in a constructive way. There's no such thing as constructive contempt, which is why I started off the conversation today by really highlighting this. And I think that we can see that this is actually true. And this is playing out in our world right now. And then the question becomes, well, what do you do with it then? If it's a universal emotion and it's going to arise, then what are we supposed to do with it? A couple theories is that this is kind of funny, is that Ekman thinks that we might have gotten contempt by accident. It has no useful purpose. We just got it. And once we got it, we can't get rid of it. It's kind of a glitch. I mean, can you think of a scenario where devaluing another person is constructive? That's tricky business. Which brings me to the next and final one. And I want to give myself a little, I'm gonna toot my own horn for a second. When I started, because I work in addiction for a long, long time, and one of the emotions that's very prevalent in the addiction world is shame. And originally, shame was not mentioned amongst the universals. And I kind of stood up to Paul and my friend Eve. I said, "You guys have got to put shame as a universal emotion because it's such a problem." And I actually asked them, I said, "Well, why is shame not a universal emotion?" And there's two reasons, and I'll tell them to you. And they're not good enough reasons for it not to be a universal. And this is interesting. This is very interesting about shame. Shame of all the emotions I mentioned does not have a universal facial recognition. Why? Because when you feel it, you don't want anybody to know. Isn't that interesting? That we have a built-in response mechanism to conceal it because shame, you do not want anybody to know that you're feeling it. The other reason, which is kind of not that interesting, but it's important, there's a bunch of white people here today, mostly white people anyway, from what I can see, is that people who have dark pigment skin, their faces don't get red for obvious reasons. You know, if somebody's really, really brown skin or really, really dark skin, they don't get that kind of red face that most of us will get when we're. And so those are the only two reasons why shame didn't make it amongst the universals. And I said, those aren't good enough reasons. We have to bring it back in. So they did. And now it's in the training manual, which I'm happy to say. And so contempt and shame are both very much, they're more complex because they're social emotions. They're all about other people. This is also interesting in the corporate world. My wife can attest to this because she's worked in the corporate world a lot. If you're a woman who's been in the corporate world, you'll know exactly what I'm about to say. Is it very common for a male to contempt a female and trigger her shame? Now, this isn't like some evil shit that people are doing. This is just how it plays out. But if I'm in a corporate situation role and I have contempt for somebody else I work with who's maybe I'm a superior to them and it triggers their shame, all of a sudden I can get them to come in on Saturday, I can get them to do all this extra work, and it can become a very, very destructive thing. And this has actually been pretty well studied in corporate America as a phenomenon that's actually pretty real. And so that's an extreme version of it. But even on a general level, contempt can easily trigger another person's shame. In some ways, contempt for self is just shame. You know, when you devalue yourself, shame, the message of shame, and I started off with this, and this was my big problem, is that shame is a belief that I am somehow fundamentally flawed. There is, in fact, something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me that's unique to me that nobody else has but me. You ever feel that way? That's shame. Now, shame is also a universal emotion. So shame and contempt, they're not going to go anywhere. And of course, there's lots of different views and opinions on this one. Um, Brene Brown is somebody who's probably done the best work on shame, I think, culturally. If you've never seen her TED Talk on shame, you should watch it. It's so good. She also has a curriculum on shame. So, the primary antidote here, if you want to start working with contempt and shame, which I suspect that you do, or I encourage you to do, is mindfulness, is just being aware when you're asserting some moral or intellectual superiority, and then disengage from the content. Back off. And that's it. Done. Right. And also the other thing too to say about contempt, that's I sort of hate to say, but it's true. Contempt kind of can feel good. We kind of like it. It's what the Buddha calls the honey-tipped arrow. At first, it kind of feels nice, but the pleasant feeling doesn't last long, and we end up kind of feeling bad about it later. Hating on other people, you know, it doesn't feel good. At least it doesn't feel good for a long time. It might at first. Shame, interesting about shame is that as soon as you experience the onset of shame and then your mindfulness arises, it more or less vanishes. It's really weird. Ironically, shame is like super easy to deal with. The problem is no, is being aware of it when it arises because shame, all the emotions, what they do, this is what makes the whole project so bloody hard, is shame or emotions in general, what they do is they shut down prefrontal activity. What is mindfulness? Mindfulness is a feature of prefrontal activity. So when you become emotional, the emotion systems is designed to shut down mindfulness. Emotions don't want you to get involved. Emotions kind of smack you upside of the head and say, get out of the way, I got this. Why? Because if you step out into the street in New York City and you're about to get hit by a bus, you're not supposed to go, gee, what kind of bus is that? I wonder if that's one of those new electric buses, or is that a diesel bus? Or, you need to get the hell out of the way. So, from a survival point of view, emotions don't want you involved. They're like, we got this. The problem is in 2024, most of the time, the emotions are arising in ways that are inappropriate to your survival. Probably by and large, probably 90% of your emotional episodes are not going to help you survive. They're just going to damage your relationships and your mental health. But they don't know that. So this is why, again, mindfulness, whether you're a Buddhist or not, who cares? Mindfulness is so valuable because what it does is it strengthens and it enhances prefrontal activity. And this is the study 101. Every single study on mindfulness. If I'm cultivating this prefrontal activity, when the emotion arises, it's not going to kick it off so easily. It's going to stay on. Your Wi-Fi signal is going to stay on. That's what you want. If that's and I'll say this, I say this in secular clinical places all the time. If that's all you get out of mindfulness, totally worth every penny. Forget about the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and all that stuff. I mean, I love that stuff too, but whatever. If you can increase, it's classic Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there's a gap, and in that gap is our power to choose. I mean, every mindfulness training, they always give that quote because it's such a good one. Between the trigger and the response is the experience. And if I can enhance my experience mindfully to be involved with my emotional life, that's what you want to do. You want to be an active participant and you want to be involved in your emotional life. But what do most of us do? We want to get rid of them. Now, the reason why middle way is so good, emotions they can lead to our greatest anguish and our deepest suffering. They also lead to our greatest sense of joy, purpose, and meaning. Just depends on how you go about it. So in cultivating emotional balance, emotions are actually enacted and used very specifically and explicitly to actually cultivate happiness and meaning. They're the vehicle, they're not the obstacle, they're the vehicle. Because if you think about sadness, what does sadness actually do? Sadness is the finger that points at everything that's meaningful to you. And of course, when you lose something that's meaningful to you, you're going to get sad, right? If it's not meaningful to you and you lose it, you just don't even care. You don't get sad. So sadness emotionally has got all of the information that you want and that you need to cultivate a meaningful life. It's all right there. So to not be involved and to not participate in that is tragic. Is it scary and does it hurt? Yeah, it's a totally it's wicked hard, but you want to do it. You want to be actively involved in your emotional life, right? And this is why, for me, the secular Dharma is because I actually was in, you can do this, and I've done it. I can show you how, but I don't recommend it. You can use Buddhist meditation techniques to actually further repress emotion. I did it. The Buddha talks about this in his teaching on the snake. It's like, so Buddhism can become, we can use it in destructive ways. We can use, attention training. We can use concentration. We can use anything. So and for me, my whole life changed in a much better direction when I started to really open to this and started to integrate the Western perspective on emotion into my Dharma practice. Oh man, the whole thing changed in a big, big way. Um, so let's pause there for about 10 minutes. All right, thank you, everybody. So let's move on a bit. So now what I will do a bit more, I don't always do this, but because this is the Bozeman Dharma community, I will now start tying some of the stuff we're talking about to Buddhist thought because it's very relevant. In fact, this is why, the Dalai Lama wanted to have this combination of both contemplative Buddhist practice as well as science, because at the end of the day, they're more or less saying the same thing from a different lexicon. And so we'll kind of try to outline that. So just one way to kind of think about that is when we say destructive and constructive, we could also say skillful and unskillful. I know that you're very used to that kind of language. So a constructive response to an emotional experience would be something that would be skillful means, which I know you're probably familiar with that barometer. That's great. And also unskillful would be a kind of destructive response. And so we in Buddhist practice we train in this way quite a bit. So to kind of get us into this, because this is really the meat of it, um, is understanding the backdrop, but just understanding that, CEB or this particular program, we don't evaluate emotions as being positive or negative based on whether they feel pleasant or unpleasant. Instead, we look at the overall outcome that emotions have on our own and others' well being. And so nearly all emotions can be enacted or expressed in ways that are both constructive and destructive, or skillful and unskillful. And so you can have skillful anger. That's the thing. And one of the things, this is where some of the cross-pollination gets sticky, um, is that, and I got this from my kind of work in recovery, is that, as I'm sure you've gathered, we oftentimes in Buddhist practice, we often talk about these, sometimes they're called poisons, but in the early tradition, they're called fires of greed, hatred, and confusion. And so a lot of times we can think, well, hatred and anger are the same. They're not. And so we have to be careful that when we teach or we're talking in a Buddhist context, we don't want to throw anger under the bus. So if you're talking about something moha or one of the Pali ones, if you're talking about hatred, make sure that you're using the word hatred and not subbing it for anger, which is quite common because anger is not always unskillful. You can have skillful anger. And so sometimes we have to be careful because, I mean, we can get the message pretty quick that, anger is a problem and we shouldn't feel it anymore. I got this in Alcoholics Anonymous because they talk about resentment a lot as being a problem. So I sort of started to repress my anger because I thought I was supposed to be. And so if I felt angry about anything, I just felt like that was bad. You ever been angry and you think to yourself, "Oh, I shouldn't be angry." It's like, well, whether you should or you shouldn't is irrelevant. Maybe you should be. Maybe you should be more angry. That's what's being said here, which I know, which kind of, when you start to kind of bridge these two systems, there can be some conflict. And this is one of the ways in which conflict can emerge. So just again, to square the circle more cleanly, destructive emotions are enacted in ways that are regrettable. So a destructive emotion, we look back on it, we regret that emotion in ways, and these enactments are incompatible with our own and other people's happiness. So, when I act in destructive emotions or unskillful emotions, I'm detracting, taking away from my sense of happiness and also the other people. So it's really important that we notice in this work that the word self and other are always being used. It's really about us. It's not so much about me. We want to use us and we language. And of course, the opposite constructive emotions are enacted in ways that are conducive to our own and other people's happiness. And the primary way in which this can be identified is there's a willingness for further cooperation and further collaboration. You know what I mean? I'm not going to. Now, this is also not to say, this is where it gets tricky, that sometimes we have to actually end relationships with people. There are people perhaps in situations where further collaboration and cooperation is not really appropriate. So there's no always and never here. But that's usually not the case. But sometimes, there are people in our lives who we've gotten to the point where I just really can't engage with this person anymore. It's actually unhelpful for me. It's uh, so that is also part of it. So nothing is always or never here, unfortunately. And to give you the another metric that kind of makes it simple, the analogy that we use in CEB is that when it comes to these emotional experiences, awareness plus choice equals freedom. And so what we want to do is we want to be free from these destructive emotional episodes. And the primary way to do that is to become emotional, to know that you're emotional, and then choose how you respond. Because we don't respond. Often we react. And so if you wanted to think about this in terms of like what's called the Four Noble Truths or the four tasks, however you hold those, is that we could say that dukkha, numero uno, that dukkha is about triggers, right? There's not much you can do about that. You know, life is hard, bad things happen, triggers happen. That is kind of part and parcel. The work of getting rid of or overcoming that is really kind of a bit of a fool's errand, and I think a big misunderstanding about Buddhist practice. And so when we get triggered, what happens, what triggers is, so when we become emotional, largely, this is kind of like when we become emotional, it's almost like the whole territory of the second noble truth on fire. Reactivity, craving, clinging, grasping, greed, hatred, confusion. When we have a flare up, when the emotional experience, when the onset, what the Buddha calls is tanha or craving, is what arises. When we come into contact with a triggering event, what arises is that tanha. I want to get rid of it. I want to have it, that. And once we get into that territory, that's really where the game begins. So all of the work that we do is post trigger. That's really, so that would be trigger experience. The experience. I use this word experience a lot. What am I experiencing right now? Well, I'm experiencing a whole range of things, physiological changes, body changes, and my narrative has shifted. And so then we would see things like greed, hatred, and confusion would arise in that space. We would see things like the five hindrances would arise in that space. And so um, this is also to the other thing that's kind of in the Buddhist messaging, and I think that can be misunderstood is, well, first of all, not only we're not supposed to, first one's not supposed to be happening, we're not supposed to be suffering. So that's a problem. Second of all, we're not supposed to cling. We're not supposed to react. And so that's kind of impossible. So we need to kind of reframe this in a way that um, the only way you can not cling is to notice that you are already clinging and then let go. Because I used to say, people always say, well, liberation through non-clinging, right? I'm like, well, how do you do that? How do you not cling? And so what we're trying to do, and just in a very systematic way, so we don't beat ourselves up for our skillfulness around it. It's like, especially emotionally, like by the time mindfulness enters the scene of the crime, a lot of shit's already, mindfulness is like the first response. But by the time you get there, there's already a kind of, there's already some shit lying around. There's already some stuff that's gone down. It is jokingly kind of a bit of a crime scene, like, oh my God, what happened here? And so what we want to be able to do is to respond to that in a constructive way. So maybe we're already upset. So part of the thing about it that's so hard is that, and I don't think there's any way around this, is you actually have to be willing to open to and to feel the unpleasant Vedana of the emotion, right? You have to be willing to do that, which feels kind of counter dharmic in a weird sort of way, you know. And so that's why we don't use negative and positive, because a lot of times, like for example, I can have an episode where I get triggered into anger. I become really, really angry, but I respond constructively. But if I look back at the event, I go, man, that was really unpleasant. For it to be skillful and for it to be constructive does not mean that you enjoyed it or that it was unpleasant. It might have been excruciating. You see how that's really kind of counter? I mean, think about it. Have you ever had a really difficult conversation with somebody that you care about and the conversation ended actually well? But when you go back and you review the conversation, you were not having any fun during it? There might have been anger, there might have been contempt, there might have been shame, there might have been a whole range of feelings. So we don't get to bypass that. That's not what we're talking about. And this is where the Western perspective on emotion is very, very relevant, because a lot of times we can get confused because we can be doing things that are constructive and skillful and be thinking to ourselves, man, that felt like I did the right thing there, but I actually felt like I was suffering quite a bit during that. We think, well, Buddha, well, how do I do that without the suffering or without the difficulty? I just don't know that you can. Hard conversations are hard conversations. Difficult experiences are difficult experiences. So it's how we respond in those situations is the metric that we use, not whether the situation was enjoyable or not. Right? This is probably why, in the Buddhist discourse, there's so much emphasis on mindfulness of feeling. Unpleasant, right? This is really unpleasant, but I'm doing really well. So it's not how you're feeling, it's how you're doing. And doing well oftentimes doesn't feel great. It's like I always use addiction because it's such a great example. Like the newly recovered addict, the person who's like, on their first month or their first couple months of not drinking or doing drugs, is having a very, very, very unpleasant experience and they are not feeling good, but they're doing great. Just like the active alcoholic or the active drug addict feels amazing and is doing terrible. Fentanyl feels good. Heroin feels good, you know, but they're destructive. So again, we really have to kind of square the circle on this whole feeling business, right? If that makes sense. And but it's weird though when you walk away from one of these, you're like, wow, that went really well, but man, that was brutal. So that what that is that that's having some tolerance, or the word I would use, and this word is very popular, is resilience. When you can moment by moment move through very, very challenging emotional experience, very, very challenging emotional territory, and you can come out the other side without doing something destructive, you just you just totally gained and trained in resilience, right? And so the definition of resilience is the overcoming of a challenge. So anytime resilience is part of the equation, there's always a challenge, right? So resilience looks good on paper. But when you're actually doing it, it's like not fun or pleasant at all. It's. So again, we have to really kind of make sure that we understand what we're actually being asked to do. So, any questions about that so far? Does make you still with me on this? So let's stop demonizing emotions, and let's start to see how we can respond to our emotional life in a way that is more skillful. And I'm always confused where to go next, but I'm going to make an executive decision and take you through this emotional episode timeline because I think it ties in better to everything I just said. And then we'll get into the Brahma Viharas a bit more. So let's see if I can find this here. Where are you? There you are. Beautiful. I'm going to do a screen share with you here in just a sec. You have this, but I think if we all look at it, it's a little bit better. See if I can get it nice and big. There we go. Bear with me. You all see this big step 1 through 5 picture? Good.
Yes.
Okay. So this is actually interesting. This is Paul Ekman's what's called an emotional episode timeline. And we're going to walk through this piece by piece. They're all defined in the handout above you. You have this. This is really good. Now, this also, for you Dharma nerds out there, this is another way to look at what's called dependent origination. This is the emotional system for how that begins. So if you look at step 2, 3, and 4, those are what I just went over. So you have the trigger, you have the state, or what's here called the experience, and then you have the response, which is constructive or destructive. This is just a further teasing out of that model. But let's look first at the precondition and the postcondition. This is very important. So the precondition is how I feel before the trigger arises. Now, this is a huge, huge encouragement for good old-fashioned self-care. Like, for example, let's just say I have to go to work tomorrow and I know I'm going to have a very difficult, challenging meeting with my boss about some very charged material. I know that that's going to happen. And let's just say I stay up late, I binge watch some Netflix, I go to bed too late, I don't get very good sleep, I wake up tired, I wake up late, I don't really eat anything, I sort of drink too much coffee, I kind of feel like shit. Before I walk into the meeting, I'm already tired and cranky and over caffeinated and under kind of slept. What do you think my chances are of responding constructively in that situation? I'm already asking for it. My precondition is I'm already worn out. Now, this is a very cultural assessment. Most people, as a society and a culture, we all kind of feel like shit anyway. Like our metabolic health is terrible. We don't eat good food. We don't take care of ourselves. So it's like one of the best things you can do for emotional health is just kind of good old fashioned take care of yourself. you know, Andrew Huberman 101, like get some sunlight, get some sleep, eat some healthy food, move your body. Like the shit that we all know to do that we don't do because we're looking for some supplement or gummy to do it for us. You know, where's the sunshine, exercise, good food, good sleep, meditation gummy? Everybody, they see this shit now. People just want to eat gummies and just, you know what I mean? It's like insane, dude. So precondition, this is just all to say that just taking care of yourself will totally will give you a huge percentage movement in the constructive episode anyway. So then when we go into the meeting and then the boss says something that triggers us. Well, there's a couple of other things. So there's the trigger, and then there's the event associating with the trigger. What is the event? The event is a very stressful meeting with my boss. I know it's going to be stressful. And then my perception database. This might be one of the most interesting and underexplored aggregates in this model. And this is really what we do in therapy, in Western therapy, where we're always exploring in our database. So, what does it mean for me to have a difficult experience with my boss? What is my historical relationship to bosses anyway? In what way do I already feel inferior to my boss? In what ways, so this is very, very subjective. What is in my database. And when you go to therapy, largely what we're talking about is our database. Why do we think what we think about certain things? What memories do we have associated with these things? What am I bringing into the experience that I don't know what I'm bringing into the experience? So this is why I like a secular dharma. There's a lot of value in us sitting down with a person or even a trained professional and having therapeutic conversations about our triggers, about events in our lives that have been triggering, and what we think those events and those triggers and those experiences mean about me, and what does it contribute to my value, and how does it contribute to my emotional landscape. There's a lot going on there. And the more information, the more facts you're armed with about what's in your database and about what your triggers are and what kind of events trigger you, the better off you're going to be. This is what we call insight. Do you have any insight? What pisses you off? What scares you? What kind of a situation would likely trigger shame? Do you have any idea? So there's so much like therapeutic self-awareness, insight work that we can be done about understanding how our system gets activated. Because if you're oblivious and you're like, oh, I got a boss with my meeting on Monday, I don't know anything about it. You go in there. If we don't, what happens is if we don't have insight into this stuff, we feel like we're getting railroaded all the time. Like I had a meeting with my boss, man, I got railroaded. It's like, well, did you know you had the meeting? Did you know that the meeting might be charged? Do you know that you don't do good, generally speaking, when you have a meeting with your boss and that you're going there nervous and you don't advocate for yourself and you get taken advantage of in these situations? Do you know that about yourself? It's like, you want to know that. So this step two in the emotional, so step one is about self-care, right? Step two is about kind of therapeutic mindfulness, about really understanding how we're wired and what are things. They're like the whole newspaper thing. Like once I connected those dots, it's like I still get the experience, but I know that it's not about the person sitting next to me with the newspaper because I have insight into that trigger. Now, I still don't like it, but it's a much different experience for me when I have these experiences. And I can just say to myself, yeah, this is like a PTS thing. Okay. That's okay. I have some meta. Look, it's okay. Like it's okay that I'm upset right now because I know why I'm upset because I have insight. I have internal mindfulness. I have external. I can read the situation in a way that's appropriate and understand that my internal response actually makes sense. Right. And we can talk about this all day. You know what I'm saying? This is really important stuff. So I can be armed with that, but the step two is always going to happen, right? This is going to continue to happen. Step three is where we go from a therapeutic kind of mindfulness to what I would call a contemplative kind of mindfulness, which is what is going to help me now. So now I went into the meeting. I was tired. I was hungry. I was over caffeinated. I got triggered by the event. It triggered all this shit in my database. Now I'm in a state, which is really kind of third foundation of mindfulness therapy. What's the mental state? I'm confused. I'm irritated. I'm angry. I feel less than. And so with that state comes physical changes. Lots of shit's happening in my body. When emotion gets turned on, there's lots of physiology, lots of Vedana. Might be pleasant, might be unpleasant, might be a combination of two, but I feel more so than I did 2 hours ago. There's a lot of feeling going on. And also with those physical changes comes a boatload of psychological changes. I'm very self-conscious. My mind is racing. I can't get my thoughts straight. I'm confused. I feel defensive, right? Now, with the intensity of that, if that gets really, really intense, what I'm going to do is I'm going to react. Unless I have some mindfulness training under my belt and I can say, okay, I'm really irritated. My mind is racing. I feel really, my body feels very unpleasant. I feel agitated. Maybe I'm just going to let this person talk. I'm going to take some deep breaths. I'm going to do some mindfulness. May I be at ease. I'm going to keep that prefrontal online. I know I'm triggered. I know I'm angry. I know I'm with my boss right now. I knew this was going to happen. That's why I got lots of sleep. I'm ready for this. How do I want to respond right now? Completely different experience. Now, if I have zero mindfulness training, zero mindfulness skills, I would argue you're going to totally react 9 times out of 10. And you're going to leave that meeting maybe with, if you have too much anger, if you have excessive anger, you're going to yell and scream at your boss and tell him what a prick he is, and you're going to get fired. Or you're going to have an anger deficit and you're going to leave that meeting with 17 million more things to do. Your desk is piled up. You just agreed to do a bunch of shit that you shouldn't even be doing that aren't part of your job description because you didn't have enough of anger. And then you walk out and you get back to your desk. You go, I fucking did it again. Jesus Christ, they always do this. Why does this always happen to me? People always take advantage of me. I always do this. Destructive, too much. Destructive, not enough. I didn't lose my job, but I certainly didn't advocate for myself. I didn't stick up for myself, right? Maybe I got shamed out because my boss blasted me with contempt. And now what's the post condition? How do I feel after the fact? I feel like I did it again. I feel regretful. I didn't stand up for myself, or I overreacted and I shouldn't have said that. And I sort of told too much truth, and now I don't have a job. Now you can apply this towards anything. I can apply this to like, I can watch too much Netflix, get crappy sleep, get up to dogs wake me up early, didn't drink any water, not enough caffeine, I'm running late, kids are going to be late for school, Coyote's 6, he won't put his shoes on, and I yell at him or I do whatever I do, right? Not the end of the world. But then I drop him off at school, and on the way home, I'm like, man, I'm a bad dad. I can't believe I yelled at my kids. He just didn't put. He just was having a hard time putting his shoes on. If I could have just waited 3 more seconds, it would have been 10 more seconds, and he would have gotten those shoes on. If I could have just sat there, but I couldn't do it. That was a destructive outcome. Did I traumatize my kid? Probably not. Is it the end of the world? No. But I regret how I handled that situation. And now I kind of feel like shit, and my day is kind of looking like it's 7:30, and I'm already feeling bad about myself. Mm. Well, let's go back through that. Well, what actually? This is why I don't generally like this whole present moment business. Like looking back and looking forward is a really good idea. And so a lot of people, like I have a couple of friends. I have a friend who did the CEB training with me, who's a marriage and family counselor. And he actually has this diagram I'm showing you actually painted on the wall in his office. And when people come in for couples therapy, all they do is run through. They're like, "Well, what was it? What did you get emotional about this week?" This is like, for those of you who have done day longs with me, we do this a lot. This is like such a this model, and you can do it by yourself. You can just like you can write this stuff down. You can at the end of the day, like did I have any regrettable emotional episodes today? Yeah, I did. Okay, what happened? Well, I didn't get any sleep. I woke up late. I didn't have any water. I got triggered because the kids were late. He didn't put on his shoes. What happened? I got really, really angry and irritated. What did I do? Well, I yelled at him. What was the post condition? Well, I felt bad about myself. Well, what can I do differently next time? You know, what are we? Mindfulness, there's a beautiful word in Pali called apalapala. And apalapala is it means to learn. And it's the aspect, and this is weird that this doesn't get talked about because mindfulness is definitely alive and well in education. But mindfulness is highly correlated to learning. What are you learning? I ask the people like, what are you learning in your practice? People are like, what do you mean? I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about your database? What are you learning about your triggers? What are you learning about your responses? What are you learning? What are you working on? So, this is also kind of another way to say, dependent origination, contact, craving, feeling, and then we respond constructively. There also is a third option here. There can be an action that's not constructive nor destructive. It can be ambiguous. Like it wasn't to call it constructive or destructive isn't quite accurate. It's just like, okay, like no big deal. That's also room for that as well. It's not always one or the other. Sometimes it's ambiguous. It's like, well, you know, I didn't really yell at the kids. I was a little hasty. I didn't yell at them. I didn't do anything that bad. I could have done a little bit better, but it wasn't really, I wouldn't go so far as to call it destructive. But, I could maybe pay a little bit more attention next time. All right. I'm gonna let you guys look at this, and you can, if you look before, if you have the handout, there's some other ones here because I need to use the restroom, and I'll come back and we can have some questions about this if you like. Stop the share so I can see your faces. Any questions or thoughts or anything you want to talk about with that? Does that make sense? Is that a helpful model? Anything come to mind? Yes, please, Kathy.
So this is all really helpful to me. And I can think of a recent situation that I've gone through with a very good friend where I was, I think I was pretty dysregulated and I didn't have a very good um, outcome post condition. And so it's possible I'm imagining that you can, if you don't respond correctly and the best way, most skillful way at the time, you can actually repair this going back. I mean, we have had a conversation since then where we both talked about what we said and what we did, and did some apologizing, and made some realizations first. At least I did for myself. And I'm just hoping that if you do this more and more, you get better at it. And this is the goal. Am I getting this right?
You couldn't be more right. In fact, what you're pointing to something important, like the emotional episode is never really over. So in that initial episode, you left with a post condition of it was destructive and you felt regrettable. But because you care enough, the relationship with the person, you value the person and you value the relationship, you decided to go back and have another episode in which you talked about that other episode. You repaired, good word. And so now, if we look at it from a 10,000-foot view, it actually wasn't really. So the episodes some episodes sort of are never over, but you can look at that short one and you can look at that one and see what went wrong. And so, yeah, you can use this as a kind of metric that's just really, really valuable. And one thing to say is that, like, if 4 out of 10 of your emotional episodes are constructive, you're crushing it. Like nobody's 9 out of 10. Like no way. It's like baseball. Like the best baseball player hits the ball 3.5 out of 10 times. Like we have to get really realistic about how hard this stuff is. 4 out of 10 is like you're like Dalai Lama level. Like you're gonna screw up all the time. Like you should just like know that. Like this is really, really, really hard. I mean, this is anti-science. Like you're biologically designed to not do that. Evolution is like, no, 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 don't do that. I got this. And you're like, yeah, I'm not so sure you do. So there's conflict. I guess that's sort of the Buddhist against the stream. Like that's, that this is what he was talking about 2,500 years ago, just from a different angle.
You.
Yeah, so the episodes are never really over. You can go back and repair. All right, good. We have a bit of time left. This shit goes by so fast. I can't believe it. So let's talk about how mindfulness in the Brahma Viharas can be utilized both as post-condition and also as constructive responses. Um, for those of you who have sat and practiced with me, I really don't, I actually think and believe that the Brahma Viharas, kindness, compassion, gratitude, and equanimity, those are mindfulness practices. They're not these separate things. They're not these if you feel like it later things. They are integral to the whole project. And thinking of them as actually mindfulness practices is I think the way to go. Mindfulness and kindness, mindfulness and compassion. And everything's mindfulness based right now. Mindfulness based self-compassion. That's like a program that Kristen Neff built because she obviously saw a need for this. Right? And it's a good program. Right? So so just more simply, these are real. So let's just use the meaning. Also, too, like these, I'm using negative or using difficult ones now because they're easier, but you can't have pleasant, positive emotion. Like you can have joy emotion episodes. They're not all challenging. If we had more time, we'd get into that. Well, let's just use the boss analogy again. Let's just say I knew I had a difficult meeting with my boss and I went to sleep early and I got good sleep and I got up early and I did some sitting in the morning. Maybe I did 30 minutes of metta vipassana and I did some that. And I'm walking into that meeting already feeling present, already feeling at ease, already feeling a kind inclination towards the boss that I actually don't even like. What do you think my chances of a constructive outcome are? Way better. That's the other thing too, like metta, like I don't have to, you have to remember that kindness is not a feeling, kindness is an action. That you can, this will blow your mind, you probably already know this, you can be kind to somebody that you don't like. Me liking you is not a prerequisite for me being kind to you, right? And being kind to somebody that you like, you really shouldn't be that impressed with yourself if you're able to do that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if that's the bar you're holding yourself to, like, wow, dude, like, I think you might want to be doing a little better than that. And so this is why we practice this. So if I'm practicing these qualities, if I have it for myself, like if I don't have any kindness for myself, if I hate myself and I'm full of self-judgment, I'm gonna have a hard life. That's gonna get if that's if that's in my database is I'm kind of a bad person and I don't really like myself. Well, that's gonna make things really hard. Right. So we can do a lot of this emotional work just by ourselves on our own cushions, transforming our database and how we feel about ourselves. Right. So also, knowing that you can also go into experiences with a little bit of care, a little bit of, like my wife's mom passed away October 1st, and I was in Durango and had to drive 4 hours to the hospital, and I knew I was going in there, and I was doing some practicing, and I was able to walk into that hospice with some presence and some kindness, but also some compassion, knowing like when I was walking into a room of basically a bunch of suffering people, and I needed to prepare myself for that, and I needed to be, how can I show up and um, you know be of service or be of helpfulness, or not having listened to a bunch of news or not being preoccupied with other stuff, right? So a lot of this stuff is like, this post condition work, a lot of it is just like it involves a whole lot of thinking and making plans and knowing what's coming up in your life, being, and again, this whole just be in the present moment and you'll be happy all the time. That's just completely ridiculous. You know what I mean? That's insane. That's just like totally not it at all. We have to strategize. We have to be thinking. We have to, you know, I mean, right? So you can have kindness and compassion in your thinking world. That's probably the best place for them, actually. And in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, which is where I think the Brahma Viharas sit anyway. And then appreciation, if I'm going to a wedding or an event, that's about other people's joy, can I go in there with already being, you know, already priming the pump of being joyous? Mm. Um, and so these practices are really, really good because what they do is they're in many ways, that's why I like the word training. When you sit in the morning in practice or you go on retreat, you're not really practicing, you're training. And then when you get into the office or to the hospice or to the wedding, you're practicing now, right? And if you don't train, your practice is going to suffer. And you're basically going to just mostly be living from whatever your reactive tendencies are. You could probably hear my child having an emotional episode on the other side of the door, perhaps. Um, so let's see if we can dig into these a little bit more to see where they become problematic, because they can. And all of these Brahma Vihara practices can be exposed or altered by what are called near and far enemies. And far enemies are sort of obvious, like the far enemy of metta, the far enemy of kindness is ill will. Right? Is ill will. Not so in some ways metta is just goodwill. We could say goodwill, kindness, friendliness. There's lots of different words that work. But really, if we think about it as goodwill, the far enemy, of course, is ill will. And sometimes you can walk into I find myself sometimes walking into a situation already preloaded with some ill will. Like, I'm gonna tell this person what time it is when I get, I'm gonna clean their, you know what I mean? Like that. You're already coming in with that, and that can also be very much justified. And then so then you can look at the near enemy is something that can kind of look like kindness that's not kindness. And this is what we would call self-indulgence. Like for me, the big example I use of this is food. Like I just turned 50. I've been exercising and eating better. I've actually lost 25 pounds in the last year, which has been very difficult and brutal. But what I can do is to be kind to myself. Sometimes I'll just be like grazing around the kitchen and have a bite of ice cream or a handful of Cheez-Its, and it's like, and I think I'm doing it as a kind of kindness for myself, but it's really actually not at all what I want to be doing. Looking sometimes my phone can be a self-indulgent thing. Instead of just being kind to myself, I'll distract myself. Being like, oh, I'm overwhelmed right now. I need to just sit down and look at my phone. And sometimes that's actually fine, but I need to be honest with myself about what I'm doing. I have to say to myself, like, I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now, and I'm just going to distract myself and look at Instagram for 5 minutes. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm choosing to do that, right? I'm not just doing it out of habituation. Um, Compassion is the one I think that is worth the most time because it's very, very complicated and it can be very, very controversial. So the far enemy of compassion, of course, is cruelty or malevolence. That's pretty obvious. But the near enemy of compassion, the Buddhist system identifies two. The first one that's a little bit easier to square is pity, is feeling sorry for oneself or feeling sorry for another person. And I think that in the greater meditation system, I think one of the things about compassion, I think compassion, first of all, is grossly misunderstood in general. But I think what a lot of times if people do that, they go, well, you feel bad. So if I'm going to have compassion for you, I'm going to feel bad too, which is kind of pity, right? And there can be some empathy there. There's certainly empathy there, but it's not really compassion. The other near enemy of compassion that gets a lot of controversy because the clinical world doesn't like it when I say this is grief. And in a Buddhist context, what grief is an aversion to loss. Grief is a sort of unwillingness to be sad. And somebody dies and we're not really accepting it. We're not really acknowledging it. We're in the it shouldn't have happened and why it shouldn't have happened. And grief is very, very much tied to those things. Um, and there's what's called the 5 stages of grief, which I think is an okay metric. But I think, you know, they say grief is a process, but it's a process we don't want to spend a whole lot of time in, to be honest with you. Sometimes people say, oh, they grieve things for years. It's like, you do not want to do that. There's a lot of suffering in grief. And really, I've noticed for me, the ultimate way out of the grief, the compassionate thing to do is to just let myself be sad and really, really mourn the loss, really feel the loss, really acknowledge that, really have that kind of cathartic sadness. And when you do that, there's really no grief left on the other side. So grief is kind of an aversion to that loss, but it can kind of masquerade as compassion in a weird sort of way. It can be very confusing. And also, it can be this strange negotiation. We can kind of say, we're like, if I meet this loss with compassion, then it won't hurt anymore. It's kind of a deal that we make that's not really a deal that's on offer, but it's like, oh, I'm going to care about this and then it's going to go away. And then when that doesn't happen, there's grieving. Because it's like, oh, actually, the reason it still hurts is because I actually don't know how to do compassion correctly, and I kind of suck at that, and I'm not really a compassionate person, actually, really at all. And so also grief usually has with it a tremendous narrative. There's your database again. Grief is generally all about me and how things don't ever work out for me, and how come it's very much it's a very self-centered kind of thing. Now, if you're in grief, you had it, I'm not trying to, again, I'm not scolding anybody here, but grief is something that you really don't want to be there for any longer than you need to. And usually the way out of that emotionally is to try to get at the emotional experience that's sitting under the psychological experience of that grief. And usually that's some kind of catharsis, sadness, eliciting connection with another person. A lot of times when people go through hardship, they do the classic, I don't want to talk about it, which it will guarantee that it will linger for eternity. And we know this when people go through hard things, they generally don't want to talk about it. And that's what you know, keeps us from the sadness and it keeps us lost in that grief pattern. Um, we will run out of time quick, but I do want to pause and see if there's any questions or you want to talk a little bit about this because I think this is a very important thing and I think it's even a bit loaded. Um, because compassion is such a complicated compassion and sadness and loss. These are huge things that we generally don't talk about or we don't really deal with very well. See what I mean? Um, so yeah, so just some stuff to really, really think about. And this is where Buddhism, I think, can become a big problem, is because Buddhism does promise the end of suffering. And it looks good on the brochure, but when you start to bring into emotions and you start kind of embracing the conversation we're having here, you can see how kind of ridiculous that is. And so this whole territory becomes a lot more challenging. It's like, maybe we should be suffering more or better. And I would say this, is there constructive suffering and is there destructive suffering? And I think that's the better metric. All right. Can we suffer in ways that are constructive? Can we be sad and connect with other people? Or can we be sad and isolate? I've done both. And then we have appreciation or mudita, joy, gratitude, appreciation. You know, the the near enemy of that is kind of not that interesting, but it's sort of this exuberance, this inability to hold it with some degree of ease. But the far enemies, I think, are more interesting in this one particularly because we're talking about things like envy and jealousy, and really the big one is comparing, you know, especially if you're hurt. And if I'm, I'll use this analogy because this happened to me when I was back when I was single and I'm very unhappy about the fact that I was single, and I would be around my friends who were in very loving, committed relationships. I didn't really have a lot of appreciation for their joy. I was jealous. You know what I mean? And so this is really, really common hold. It's a lot of times what blocks us from embracing or participating in joy is like we think it needs to be ours, and we can compare and we can become envious. Um, and the big ones, I think the biggest blocks to joy is first of all is feeling unworthy of it. Unworthiness is actually a enemy to all the Brahma Viharas. That one I haven't struggled with so much. The one that usually gets me is um, joy is actually scary because I know that whatever I feel joy about or excited about or happy about, I'm going to lose. And when I lose it, it's going to hurt so bad that I don't even want to deal. Which I did that for years. It comes with a range of consequences, but it's kind of like, and I said it earlier, like, okay, no joy, no sadness. I was like, I'll take that deal. And there was times in my life, if you sat me down and said, okay, I will guarantee that you'll never be sad again, but you'll also never experience joy again. There's times in my life I'd have taken that happily. I'd have been like, sign me up, man. That sounds great. And that's where we get into this near enemy of equanimity, which is indifference or apathy or a kind of non-participation, kind of, this is all just too messy and just all too hard and all too complicated. I don't even really want to deal with any of it. I'm just going to isolate. I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm just going to play it safe. I'm going to become actually in many ways very monastic, which, if you make that choice, I have no criticism of that. In many ways, I sort of tried that one. Um, but we have to all, you know, this is very subjective on how much of this we want to participate in and how we want to negotiate this kind of emotional system, because everybody here has a very different, even though the universal emotions are universal, our subjective experience of them is vastly, vastly different. And so it's really in your best interest. And there's lots of work you can do, writing work. I used to teach this stuff in treatment centers a lot. Like, like one of the things that we used to do is you can write a story, a narrative, like a one-page story about yourself through every emotion. Here's one page on sad Dave. Here's one page on angry Dave. Here's one page on scared Dave. Here's one page on shame Dave. And you can write your little narrative you have, because you have all these narratives, and then you can look at all of them together and see how ridiculous they are when you try to square them together. All right. And so what it is, and then it gives you some good information, like, what emotions do you feel like you understand, that you access? Maybe you're like, oh yeah, I understand what fear is. I notice when I'm fearful. I have some tools for that. And there might be some emotions like you're like contempt. Gee, like I didn't even know, like, I don't know. That was my big awakening. I was like, I don't even know what this is. This is weird. What are you talking about? And then I start watching. I'm like, ooh, this is happening all the time. And I just think that I'm, better than a segment of the population. I have the moral, superior, more sophisticated perspective on things than other people, which is Buddhist exceptionalism and contempt and these kinds of things. So having where the integration of what I call a secular Dharma, when you start to really merge this emotional kind of stuff with a Dharma practice, things get really exciting and very, very interesting, because you start to realize you're almost being introduced to a whole nother territory of your life that you just kind of didn't really maybe notice so much. And once you kind of move into that space, it really reveals itself in a way where emotions aren't really, we really have to get out of this thing that emotions are these problems that we sort of need to solve. Like just even the idea that emotions are sort of bad or wrong or problematic, that right there is a misunderstanding. So I'm looking at I feel pretty good about this. I feel like I got to all the stuff that I wanted to get to. I hope that this makes sense. Again, this is a whole, I did a 2 year training on this. So this is definitely not light material, but I hope like I said at the beginning, I hope you get a sense of how mindfulness and emotions can kind of be brought together from both kind of having a Buddhist background and this other understanding of them. Is really a way to maybe enliven or enrich your practice, especially when you practice with a big scale.